right, hello everyone. Full disclosure, I have tried to record this lecture multiple times now, and something keeps interrupting it every time. So hopefully this time is a charm, and yeah. Welcome to week 2 of Gender in Society, our summer session. So let's dive into it. We are thinking about intersectionality this week, and we're thinking about how our authors for this week, such as Audre Lorde and the Combahee River Collective, ask us to understand intersectionality as this shift toward engaging multiplicity, and engaging multiplicity in service of dismantling oppressive systems. So what does that mean? Engaging multiplicity. Multiplicity takes shape as understanding various marginalizations and privileges simultaneously. So, rather than parsing out social identities as these individual dimensions of experience, we're thinking about how these identities simultaneously produce a range of effects and impacts on our daily lives. So what's key is that the authors ask us to connect understandings of social identity to a critique of capitalism. So thinking about, if we live in this political economic context that impacts our social and cultural relations, to continuously prioritize profits over social welfare, that's going to operate as a stratification system in its own right, continuously rationalizing hierarchies of race, gender, class, ability, and so on. So, if intersectionality emphasizes, this push towards engaging the multiple, thinking about multiple identities and experiences simultaneously, we're really not, and I'm tripping on my words, we're really not shying away from complexity in this context. So, we're thinking about how we need to, grapple with that complexity, not move away from it, really confront it, and, think about how our own relationships to privilege and oppression take shape. So, what is privilege? So we are thinking first about how one of our authors for this week, Peggy McIntosh, defines privilege as this pack of unearned benefits and assets that folks remain oblivious to. So, if you don't have a disability, all of the things, you don't need to think about or experience stress about is a product of your privilege. You don't need to, you're oblivious to it. You don't need to think about it. If you're a white person, not needing to think about the dangers that can come from being stopped by law enforcement, or having discussions with your kids to prepare them for being stopped by law enforcement. Those things that some might remain oblivious to, that's a product of privilege. So oblivion is a powerful tool here in relation to privilege because, becoming aware of the way that the world works to, unfairly benefit some and not others, to, create different levels of stress for some, create, different things that people need to worry about that others just don't need to think about, that asks us to, really confront the ways that we're complicit in oppressive systems. So, really unpacking, how oblivion functions for each of us, is a way to dismantle systemic privilege. So, case in point, we could think about this in relation to, K through 12 curriculum, and think about teaching histories of colonization, and thinking about how often in K through 12 curriculum we don't learn histories of colonization that really delve into different elements of factual elements of what took shape with the colonization of the Americas. So we're really taught to valorize colonial violence, and we see that even in debates around the Richmond monuments. So thinking about looking toward colonizers as being worthy of honor and respect. That's a way of, reinforcing, the valorization of colonial violence. So, really delving into that and thinking about, what is taught is just as important as what is not taught. So, what is said is just as important as what is not said. So if you leave out, aspects of history related to colonization, that is a way of reinforcing the oblivion that grounds the continuation of racism. So, for further examples, Peggy McIntosh offers this list of privileges of, how everyday racism takes shape. And, we could think about things like, the whiteness of different social spaces, dolls and makeup lines with limited shades, intervening and dismantling all of these various examples of everyday racism is really key to redesigning social systems in service of equity rather than domination. So, thinking about how Marilyn Frye also offers us a working definition of oppression. So, thinking about how oppression could be understood as the suffering and frustration that befalls one partly because of one's membership in a social group. Oppression very often takes shape as the experience of different double binds. So, double binds would be situations where there's a lack of choice at play, so limited options that are characterizing someone's experience. So, the ability to have options is often so much so a reflection of privilege. And, I think about there's a moment, if anybody watched the Hulu show Little Fires Everywhere, where Kerry Washington turns to Reese Witherspoon and says, you didn't make good choices, you had good choices. So it really reflects that, that idea that, the lack of choice can lead to, these experiences of being in a double bind where people need to turn to different forms of survival that can create, cyclical disadvantages and, really contribute to the reinforcement of systemic oppression. So, for instance, with a lack of choices in a double bind, we could think of examples like, needing to sell drugs in order to support your family, being stopped, by police, experiencing incarceration, and then upon release, because you have a record and, having limited options, limited choices as a result, somebody might need to turn to those same survival economies and, sell drugs. So thinking about, generally, how survival economies such as selling drugs emerge because, people need to make ends meet, they need to take care of their families, and there's so many challenges that arise due to, the lack of choices and options, that are produced by systemic oppression. So, like Marilyn Frye highlights, we really need to look at a person's identities and experiences simultaneously. So, really engaging that sense of intersectionality and thinking about, how she uses this metaphor of a bird cage and thinks about how, if we look at one individual bar of a bird cage, we might think, why doesn't the bird just fly around it? But, from a macroscopic point of view, we could see the variety of bars that are surrounding that particular bird and think about, how the variety of identities and experiences that may be producing a range of effects and impacts are preventing that bird from just flying away. So, so too with oppressive systems, we think about how individual acts, individual choices examined outside of their place, within the bigger picture may not necessarily appear harmful, even when they are contributing to this larger structure. So I like to use the example of catcalling, to illustrate this. So, think about how individual acts, for instance, of street harassment. So in other words, people, shouting, "Hey, baby," all of the different things you might hear if you're walking down Broad Street and, people are, engaging in some catcalling. One individual act of that may seem like no big deal to someone who has not experienced it, but when you think of the frequency and the commonality of this, so, how often it happens, thinking about how common it is across different social groups, and how various comments will be racialized, or intend to demean, trans or gender nonconforming people, you get a picture of how catcalling reinforces these social structures of intersectional gender oppression. So, Marilyn Frye discusses what social structures are by noting all of our behaviors and activities are structured by more than individual choices. Structure consists of boundaries, limits, and barriers. So, for instance, if it feels unsafe for an individual to, wear revealing clothes when walking down Broad Street or go to a particular party, or if it feels unsafe to express your gender how you want to, that's because we live in a culture that normalized, people feeling entitled to commenting on others' appearances or expressions of gender. And that is an expression of social dominance on the part of those that feel entitled to comment on people's bodies, to comment on how they express their gender. So, thinking about the ways that, someone's individual choice to, wear those things, it contributes to this sense of victim blaming that, people will say, like, well, why did you wear that particular outfit? But really, it's part of this larger social structure that has made certain people feel entitled to, comment on others' bodies, etc. So it's important to think about, too, that desire to express social dominance through catcalling, and calling people names, that comes from social pressures to uphold standards of masculinity, which we'll talk about in the weeks to come. But, these are social structures at play, and, they restrict, it's important to think about, on this macroscopic level, they restrict men, women, non-binary people, gender nonconforming folks alike. So, yeah, let's talk a little bit more about some terms that, we could think about when we're discussing how gendered expectations take shape. So thinking about gendered expectations through this intersectional view. And in sociology, there's a few terms to help us think through this. There's gender accountability and gender policing. So gender accountability would refer to this gentle way of inducing conformity. So it's, essentially asking for an explanation for gender transgressions. So it could take the form of, a son saying to their dad, like, I can't go hunting, Dad, I have football tryouts. So, it's a really goofy, corny example, but thinking about, this way of being able to rationalize why, you can't participate in this gendered expectation, it's a way to, be accountable to those gendered expectations. So gender policing, on the other hand, would be a way to exact conformity. So it's a way to push people to conform. And that can come in the form of bullying or name calling, loss of connections, or even violence. So, gender policing could be seen as the elevated form of gender accountability. And an example of gender policing could, be seen as, just to use another example, say a little boy wants to hang out with his aunts in the kitchen during a holiday, and, he doesn't want to watch sports. Other guys in the family might bully him, call him names, and that is a way of policing gender and, making sure that people fall in line with what gendered expectations are of them. So, thinking about how, gender accountability, gender policing, it's very contextual. So it's important to think about how, policing and accountability will shift depending on the social context. So, for instance, stopping at a restaurant in a small in a small rural Virginia, a very small rural Virginia town, that could put one at risk for gender policing in different ways than, like going to a queer dance party in Richmond. So, the context is going to impact, how gender policing, how instances of gender accountability can take shape. So, we may, I'm just thinking about the small things still. What a day. So, anyways, we might, we may ask others to, keep us accountable to gender norms by, you know, asking them to essentially evaluate our performance of gender. So, we see this particularly prevalent on social media. So, for instance, using the example of like influencers, may ask people to participate in evaluating their performance of gender by, encouraging their followers to buy, like those terrible detox teas or like weight loss lollipops or something like that. So that reinforces, anti-fat bias and feminized standards of beauty. So it's this way of, asking people to validate, one's expression of gender and all of the, expectations that come along with that. Okay, so finally, I'm about to wrap this up. Sorry, this is taking. I feel like this is going to be a long lecture, but yes. So finally, I'm going to share with you all this video by performance artist Alok Vaid-Menon, and they reflect in this video on examples of gender policing. So how gender policing takes shape for them, and thinking about the intersectional dimensions of it. So they really put gender policing into an intersectional view by talking about how they endure Islamophobia alongside homophobia and transphobia. So, they also talk about how style is political, which is really interesting, and, how what we wear can be an act of resistance to structures of policing, really defying expectations to codify binary gender. And Alok draws attention to, social biases around trans expressions of femininity. So thinking about, working to dismantle ideas of flamboyance as being this attempt to imposter cisgender womanhood. And, thinking about the importance of seeing expressions of fabulousness in their own right rather than, through this lens shaped by gender policing and accomplishing, binary gender. So there's also this, really interesting discussion in their video on, intervening in harassment. So thinking about the dynamics of what it looks like to intervene in gender policing. And, I think about how this can take so many forms. So thinking about, intervening in gender policing can be as simple as, if, a cisgender guy is hanging out, with other dudes and just saying something to the effect of, hey, like, don't talk about that person that way, or, that person actually uses these pronouns, like something, really casual and just a way to, call people in gentle ways in conversation. And, thinking about, all of the various ways in our everyday conversations, we can do this work of intervening in gender policing and, really working to dismantle how those gendered expectations take shape. So, with that, sorry about this clunky, goofy video, but I will see you all on the discussion board. I hope you have a wonderful week, and yeah, have a great night.